So we had our background in and we had it animating a little bit like it's on the screen now, which was giving us the illusion of movement. This time we're actually going to get some movement happening. So we're going to create some keyboard events that will allow our little spaceship character to move up and down the screen. This is going to have to involve some variables, something we'll talk about. And we're also going to take a second step where we're going to prevent it from actually moving off the screen. There's quite a bit that we need to do in this video. There's a few concepts we've got to get in our minds. But for now, let's just get some basics going. So we're going to be opening up our player object, and we're going to have to start by giving it an event. So if you don't have the events open for some reason, so you close it off, for example, just click on events here, and it opens out this pop-out. Now to add an event, we click on the button at the bottom, and we can then choose from all the events that are possible. For now, we're going to use the key events, and we're going to be using the up and down arrows on our keyboard. Now, you'll notice there are three key events at the moment. There is a key down, a key pressed, and a key up. Key down means the keyboard is being pressed, and we're going to be using that one because it allows for repeating action. And if you look a little bit at the icons, you might be able to work out that a key pressed and the key up actually refer to the physical movement of the key. So key press means as you push the keyboard button down, and key up as you release it. But the key down basically allows us to just recognize that the key is physically being held at the moment. So we're going to choose the key down, and we'll start with the up arrow. And we can see now that we have an event in our list of events here. And this section here is where we're going to start writing our first piece of code. Okay, let's have a little look at this. GameMaker uses a programming language called GML. It's very similar to some other languages, but basically it's not too difficult. There's lots of great references and resources either built into the product itself and obviously online. But to start with, we're just going to look at some basic things. Now, before we get into this, let's actually go back to our room for a moment, and we're just going to talk about some concepts. So here we have our room shown by the space we have available. Now, it's a little bit tricky to understand, so just work with me here. When you talk about the position of something, it's a little bit like when we do Cartesian planes in maths, we talk about the x and y position. So in a normal mathematics sense, you have your x and y, and you'd have the origin being in the center of them, and x would get bigger going towards the right of your origin, y would get bigger going up, and you'd go into negatives down and to the left. In GameMaker, we still talk about the x and y position, but they actually begin from this top left-hand corner. So x is still the horizontal, and it does still get bigger as we go across, but it starts at x being 0 here on the left-hand side. We also still have negative, but that goes off into the space that we can't see, all right? And by the same token, the positive x actually continues past what we can see as if it was an infinite space, essentially. The trickier one is the y. Now again, I said it starts in this top left corner. So this top left corner vertically is y 0, but it doesn't get bigger as it goes up. In fact, it gets bigger as it comes down our screen. So y is increasing as it comes down in this direction. And from this point, y would be negative going up in this direction. Now you might already be picking up that because x gets bigger this way, that's why we did a negative direction for the movement of our background in the last video, so that it moved towards the left. It was moving in the negative direction. But yeah, that idea that this top left corner is 0, 0, and x gets bigger that way and y gets bigger going down is the first really slightly different thing you've just got to get into your mind. Because whenever you talk about a position of something, you're going to have to think about that. When we're moving an object around in here, just make sure I'm on the instance layer. So here's our object. You might notice down in this corner, in fact, even as we move our mouse around, down in this left corner here, we're seeing our x and y coordinates. The x, of course, being the first value and the y being the second value. So we can sort of get a feel for what our positions are as we move our mouse around. And again, we talked about the size of the room being 1024. So if I put my mouse just near the very edge of the visible room, you can see that first number is 1024. And the height of the room, so 0, 0 up here, and as I go down, it should be approximately 768. And it's just off my screen at the moment. So we can see how our coordinates work. All right, so that's the room coordinates and how we find our position. But how does that refer to our object? Okay, let's jump back to the sprite for a second. Okay, so in our sprite, we may remember right back in the first video, we talked about this special little point called the origin, and this is where it's going to come into play now. So this point is the single dot, basically, that we take the x and y coordinates for this image. So even though the whole image in this case is 128 by 128 square, this point right here is where we actually take our x and y coordinates. And as I said earlier, I like to put it around about center of the image, not necessarily just the picture, but the actual image space. And you'll see why in a moment why that's useful. But basically it's got to do with positioning and making sure that we can easily tell sort of half of each of these positions. Again, that might become a little bit clearer in a second. All right, so hopefully we're starting to get that the character or the object has an XY position, which is determined by the origin that we set, and the X and Y positions of our room are set, and that Y gets bigger as we go down, and X gets bigger as we go across. With all that in mind, let's now try and get some movement happening. So, back to our object and back to this event that we started. So this is supposed to be the up event, which means we'll be changing our Y value. So we're trying to move something vertically. So if we want to go up the screen, remembering that Y gets bigger going down, we have to work with negatives. We have to take something away. So every object has an X and Y value stored automatically in a variable. Now, if you've never heard of variables before, basically they're just a placeholder. They're a value that you use, a name basically for a value that's going to change over time. So X and Y are common ones because we talk about those in maths. So this particular object, this player object we have, has a Y value already built in. So Y, and we're just going to now say it's equal to the Y value, let's say minus 5. So basically what we have here is a variable Y that's already built in, and it's changed color to tell us it's a variable that's built in, is equal to whatever it is right now minus another 5. So just a basic maths equation takes 5 away from Y and puts it back into Y. Essentially we're just changing the actual position of the object by changing the actual Y value. So whatever it is now, take 5 away, that's its new Y position. Let's see how that works. So if we play our game now, so it looks like we've got forward movement, just remember that's only the background. If we press our up button and hold it down, we can see that it's moving up. Nothing happens, I'm currently pressing my down button, nothing's happening there. Let's fix that one up. So we'll close this off, and we can close that one, and what we need to do is add a new key down event, and this time it's going to be our down arrow. And for those of you who are thinking ahead a little bit, it's going to be Y equals Y plus 5. Going down, the Y value is going to increase. Whoops, I forgot the Y part. There we go. So let's see if that works. So our up arrow still works, and now we should have a down arrow. Excellent. So we now have what looks like a ship that we can fly through space. Now remember, we're not doing left and right keys because we're simulating the forward movement by using the background scrolling, but we've got our up and down now. Okay, now let's see interesting part. If we keep pressing a button, whoops, our character goes off the screen, because all we're doing is increasing or decreasing our y value. And as we said earlier, although y gets to be 0 at the top here, it goes off infinitely into negatives now in the up direction. And if we go down a screen, although it gets to 768 at the bottom, it continues infinitely in the positive direction. So we can, in fact, take our character off the screen. Got a little bit of a screen glitch there. But basically, our character continues even though we can't see it anymore. So what we want to do now is to work out a way to stop our character going off the screen. And that's where our origin is going to start to come in as well. If you think about it, what we want to do is almost have an imaginary line here that stops the character going off altogether. So remember, the origin's around about here somewhere, so we want to stop it moving off. And the same thing in the downwards direction. We want to stop it just a little bit before it goes all the way off the edge of the screen. So what we need to do is introduce some logic to our commands. So let's just start with the up one. It's a little bit easier. So we'll go with our up. So instead of just changing the value every time that the key is held down, first what we're going to want to do is check where we are now and whether or not where we're about to move to will actually cause the character to go off the screen. So we're going to introduce a new part of the commands called if. Now, an if is the most basic logical question that you can ask in computer programming. It basically asks if something is either true or false, and you get the option of doing something if it's true, and you get the something if it's false. So it's what we call a Boolean expression. It has two possibilities, true or false. So we write our expression inside some brackets, and then we will have a curly brace. Now be careful that you don't mix them up. That's an opening one, and we have a closing one to say what's true. And then we have the keyword else, and we have another opening curly bracket and another closing curly bracket for the false. So whatever goes inside these brackets here will happen if this is true, and this would happen if it's false. Now you can leave the false section out and the else. You can just have the if true. But often you'll end up with both. So I like to sort of write it out like I've got here to start with and fill in the things I need. So what is it that we want to ask? Let's start by just making sure it doesn't go off the screen altogether. So if the Y position is going to be less than or equal to 0, that's what we're going to go with. Remembering 0 is the Y value at the top of the screen. So if the Y value is going to be less than or equal to 0, we are going to move our character. Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. If the Y value is greater than or equal to 0, sorry. So we're basically saying if it's below the top of the screen. So if it is, what we'll do is put that in here. Having some trouble with my copy and paste there, sorry. Okay, so currently we're saying if our Y value is going to be greater than or equal to 0, we're going to take 5 away from it, and that will move our character. So let's give that a little try. Remembering each time that we actually move, our Y is changing. So at some point, our Y could become less than 0. So let's go up. Okay, so I'm still holding down my button, my up arrow, but you can see it's not going off. I can come back down, but I just can't go all the way off the screen. Now have a look at where it's actually getting stuck. And if you remember back to the sprite, the origin, the point that we go by, is just below the blue of the curve. And again, if I look at the actual game as it's playing, oops, I forgot to close it, sorry. Let's just do it again. So it's just below the blue, and if we look at where it stops, again, you can see it's just below the blue, so exactly as it hits. But what we don't want is it actually going off the screen at all. What we'd like to do is stop something like that. So this is where that imaginary line comes in. Now this sprite is 128 by 128, and we put our origin in the middle, which means it's about 64 from the top. So what we kind of want is a pretend line about 64 pixels from the top. So basically our origin will get stopped at that point. So the way we're going to do that, let's go back to our code. Don't need that open. So the way we're going to do that is get our object, get this. So we're not going to look at if y is greater than or equal to 0. We now have to think about a position 64 pixels away from 0. So 0 is the absolute top of the screen. We want to come down by 64. So if y is going to be greater than or equal to, let's just say 64. Anything that gets below 64 means our sprite's going to go a bit too far and we can't go back up anymore. So let's try that again. So now think about, we've got a pretend line essentially at 64 pixels down on our y. So as I hold my up arrow, there you go, my ship's getting stuck. So our line at 64 is about here, as if we had an imaginary line. So we can no longer go off the screen in the up direction. What about this now? Sorry, just before we go to down, because everything's happened in the true, we don't really need any of this. So just for cleanliness, we'll get rid of it, and that's perfectly fine. You can't have the negative, the false option without the positive, right? So if you're going to just do something in the false section, you still have to have a blank one up here. But because we're only worried about the true for this statement, we can just get away with a slightly shorter if statement. Let's have a look at down. Okay. When we look at the bottom of the room, we know at the moment what the measurement is here, 768 or whatever it was, but we don't actually have to remember that number. One of the good things is GameMaker has a couple of built-in variables for the room, one of them being room width, which tells us exactly how many pixels wide the room is, so basically what this edge value for X would be, and it also has a built-in value called room height, which basically tells us what the maximum Y value will be to get the bottom of the screen. So we don't actually have to know the value, we can use those built-in variables. So we're going to do something very, very similar. We're going to say if, we'll do our brackets, sorry, try that again. If our brackets, and as I said before, I like to set my command up so that it's ready to go if I need it. So if our Y value is going to be greater or equal to, now we don't want to say 64 here because that would be right near the top where it was before, and we don't want to put the actual value 768 in, we want to use that special variable. So it's going to be room underscore height, so you can see it's changed color, minus 64, because remember room height gives us the very, very bottom, and Y gets bigger as we go down the page, so we want to step back a bit from that, so taking it away. So room height minus 64. So that 64 comes from the fact that we know where the center of our sprite is. And as we saw before, if that's true, we want to say Y equals Y plus 5. And we'll just take this part here away because we don't want to do it twice. Again, we don't need the else actually, so let's get rid of that just to clean it up and give it a little try. So again, we haven't changed anything with the up arrow, so that should still be working fine, but we will test, and then we'll test our down arrow. So our up arrow going up, not a problem. Now our down arrow, ooh, we've gotten stuck. Why is that? Let's have a look at our code. Oh, we did a greater than. That was silly. It should be less than or equal because our Y should be less than the maximum value of room height minus 64. So a little typo, a little what we call a logic error or a bug basically we introduced there. So sorry about that everybody. That's just programming for you. And that's why we keep testing and retesting. So now, yep, there's our down arrow, and let's check. All right, we're not going off the screen. I'm still holding it down. I know you can't see it, but you got to trust me on that. We're not going off the screen, and I can still go up again. We're still getting that little glitch at the bottom. That's obviously my computer, but we can move our character up and down now. All right, so there's a lot in this little idea of just simply moving up and down, because we've introduced variables, we've introduced the X and Y positions, we've also introduced the if statement. So a couple of really, really important concepts there, just for something as simple as moving up and down. So have a go, put those into your program, get your character moving up and down. I think what we'll do next time is we'll probably introduce shooting. So we'll get our little character to shoot a little bit. Okay, go off and have a go for yourself.